Well, welcome. I'm your host, Cindy Watson, and today we're talking with Doug Null about negotiating and peacemaking. So welcome, Doug. It's so great to have you here.
Oh, thank you, Cindy. A few bobbles to get here, but I'm glad I'm here.
Likewise. And for those who don't know Doug, here's a little bit about him. He got a really interesting background, and I just can't wait to roll up our sleeves and dig in today. Doug left a successful career as a trial lawyer to become a peacemaker, and his calling is to serve humanity, and he executes that calling at many levels. He's an award-winning author, he's a teacher, a professor, a trainer, a highly experienced mediator, and Doug's work carries him from, he does international work, from that end of the perspective to helping people resolve interpersonal, deep ideological conflicts. And he does work training life inmates to be peacemakers and mediators in maximum security prisons. Such an interesting guy. I had interviewed him for my Practicing with Purpose podcast and immediately knew we just had to get him here to share some of his insights with you. So why don't you kickstart us, Doug? Just tell us a bit about yourself and what drew you to this kind of work.
Well, as you mentioned, I went to law school, and after law school, moved to Central California. I'm a native Californian, and clerked for a year for a judge, and then went into private practice. And I tried my first jury trial 2 months after I joined the firm as a 28-year-old associate. And my second trial was a defense of a $36 million securities fraud case in the federal court in San Diego. That's how it started. So for the next 22 years, I was a pretty hardcore trial lawyer. Along the way, I started studying martial arts. And after I earned my second degree black belt, I started studying Tai Chi. And in Tai Chi, there are two interesting paradoxes. One is the softer you are, and the other is the more vulnerable you are, the more powerful you are. Which really interesting paradoxes. And of course, did not compute with me being a hardcore trial lawyer, secondary black belt, all around arrogant asshole. I really admit that. But in my mid 40s, well, 97, I think, 96, 97, I was trying a case and I was cross-examining somebody, and the thought came to me, what the heck am I doing in here?
Yeah.
And after that, I went on vacation and spent the week thinking about my career so far and decided that this was not for me. I didn't know what I was going to do. When I came back home, I was driving out of the mountains to my office, and I heard a public service announcement for a new master's degree in peacemaking and conflict studies being offered at Fresno Pacific University. Oh. And I enrolled, and for 3 years, I was a full-time graduate student, again, a 3/4 time law professor at our local law school. And a full-time trial lawyer. And ultimately, after many discussions with my partners, it turned out that there was just not going to be a fit for me. They didn't like the idea of me becoming a peacemaker when I was the second highest earning partner.
I bet.
Right. So I walked out. I gave 1 week's notice and walked away from $10 million and started my own peacemaking practice on November 1st, 2000. And that's kind of how it all started.
Oh my gosh, so brave. And you definitely had your epiphany earlier than I did. It sounds like we had similar epiphanies, but I am embarrassed that I came to mine much later. And similar, doing a cross-examination one day, the witness is crying, and I'm like, what have I become? Like, what? Look in the mirror, don't like what you see. So tell me, what does peacemaking mean to you?
Well, of course, it's a loaded term. But I've spent a lot of money with branding people trying to figure out, is there another word we can use? And the difference between peacemaking and mediation really is, and if we're talking about legal mediation, the mediation of a litigated dispute, in most litigated disputes, relationships are not important.
Yeah.
It's really all about the money. How does one person or one party pay the other party enough money to make the lawsuit go away and get settled? And there's a lot of benefit to that, of course. And I do a lot of litigated mediations. But in peacemaking, the conflicts are often much, much deeper.
Yeah.
They're very emotional. Oftentimes there are important relationships that are at stake, and litigation is not a good option. So you can think about family business conflicts or internal board disputes or community disputes or ideological conflicts. I've done a lot of work with congregations and synagogues where they get into those internal disputes over liturgy, for example. And in those cases, it's not hardball negotiation, and it's not a distributive negotiation where you're just negotiating over money. It's a lot deeper than that. And it takes a much broader skill set to help people not only resolve the conflict, but hopefully reconcile and restore relationships.
Yeah. Well, I love that. And, as you're talking, Doug, I love the idea about using the term peacemaking across the board, because as you're speaking, and it's one of the problems I have with, I call it the art of feminine negotiation, but people immediately, when they hear that negotiation, picture, the boardroom, power suits, that conflict. I love this idea because really every negotiation ultimately is about relationships, and what a shift it would be if we approach all of our difficult conversations or negotiations in life from that perspective. I think it's a beautiful new model. And I think sort of the time is now to see that shift. So I'd love, what do you teach your students about peacemaking?
Well, there are many different peacemaking processes depending upon what's at stake. And it could be anywhere from doing something as simple as just listing another person into existence to doing a listing peace circle with a group of people who are enmeshed in conflict to doing interest-based mediation, where instead of trying to figure out what the dollar amount is, we try to figure out what are the interest, needs, goals, and desires of the parties, and then how do we craft some kind of agreement that satisfies everybody's needs. And so, the processes all vary depending upon the nature of the conflict, the nature of the parties, and that sort of thing. But it's just not one process. It's multiple processes, multiple skills that you can bring to bear on a problem.
I love that. And tell us a bit, like, dig a little deeper, because I think the listening sort of peace circles is one that probably is not familiar to most people. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
So peace circles have been around for a long time. We think they originated with indigenous practice, but we're not sure. But the process, as we teach it in Prison of Peace, and as I utilize it, is that you are asked to comment on a question. For example, what's your perspective on this conflict? And the circle, it has a centerpiece and a talking piece. Only the person with a talking piece can speak. When the person is done speaking, he or she will pass the stick to the left. When he or she is done speaking, turn to the person on the left who's going to be the next speaker. And that person then has to reflect back the words, the intended meaning, and the emotions of the person that just spoke, so that the speaker feels deeply heard and validated. And when the speaker says yes, the talking stick gets passed to the person who just did the reflection. And that person is now the speaker. And we go around the circle. The circle keeper is the person that asks the questions and maintains the container for this to all be working. And since you're only one person is speaking at a time and is usually limited to just a couple of minutes for each question, it's 98% listening and only 2% talking. And amazing things can come out of these circles when people are in deep conflict. Because it's so slow, if they get reactive, they have time to calm down. And if somebody across the circle says something and it's not your time to speak, you can't say anything. You just got to sit there and stew in your anger. And that has a lot of really healthy effects.
Well, and I love, because I don't know what your thoughts are, but I think in North America in particular, we don't listen well. We are not taught to listen well. We're not conditioned to listen well. We're waiting for our turn to speak. We're thinking about what we're going to say. And I think that reflection piece is also missing because we don't listen deeply enough to be able to reflect. And I call it elevated active listening. But one of the things that I've found in tough negotiations that can be really effective when you're reflecting back what the other person says, be as gracious as possible, like actually frame their argument or their position even more eloquently than they did. And I don't know about your experience, but to me, you see an amazing shift in dynamic, and there's it triggers a reciprocity and an openness that wasn't there before. So
it's very disarming. And if you reflect back their emotions, you calm them down. So whatever emotional charge they had goes away instantly. So learning how to listen and how to reflect and what to listen for and what to reflect is critical. And what I've learned is that old active listening stuff, the old I statement stuff that's been taught, still is taught. It's all based on the work of Thomas Gordon, who was a 1950s psychologist, and it's completely discredited, but people still teach it. And I don't know why, but they do. And so I just tell my students, forget what you ever learned about active listening. The proper term is reflective listening using a you statement, not an I statement.
Well, and actually explain that just for our listeners who don't get that, because I think you just hit at the crux of that really important distinction between that I versus not. So just explain why you think that sort of active listening system we've been taught is not really the most effective way to go.
When we're trying to reflect, so to make the speaker feel heard, we've got to reflect from the speaker's frame of reference. So whenever we use an I statement, all of a sudden we're now talking from my own listener's frame of reference. And I'm no longer listening to the speaker's frame of reference. And the effect of it is to really anger the speaker, because now they're not being listened to. So in order to stay on the speaker's track and to reflect from the speaker's frame of reference, I got to use a you statement. So I might paraphrase with a you statement, what you said was, and then paraphrase, or I might core message, which is a way of helping people find intended meaning, or I might affect label, which is reflecting back your emotional experience that you just had as you were telling your story or whatever you were talking about. But no matter what, whether it's paraphrasing, core messaging, or affect labeling, always going to use a you statement. You.
So beautiful. And I want to really put a pin in that for our listeners out there as well. That distinction, it may seem very subtle, but our society, and again, in North America in particular, we're very self-centered. And it's one of the big, I call it one of the 7 deadly sins of negotiation, that bringing ego to the table and using those I statements is all about that ego again. It's all about me. It's all about what I want, as opposed to flipping the lens. So when you find yourself in a negotiation in that I mode, or that where you see ego popping up, I always say, stop, drop, stop, drop, roll, pause, and get curious, flip it back to the other party. So thanks so much, Doug, for that distinction. I think it's so important, and it is so often overlooked. And you're right, we are still teaching those other models that are very ego-based, right? Very self-centric.
Well, the other thing about using I statements in that kind of listening, it's self-soothing. In other words, I use an I statement because first of all, it's passive voice. What I hear you saying is X. So passive voice is a voice of distance rather than a voice of connection.
Yeah.
And I'm distancing myself. And so it's like I'm protecting myself against you.
Yeah.
And that does not build connection, and that does not build bridges. The other thing, since we're talking about negotiation, and the other thing we do that I teach is never ask questions.
Okay.
Especially as lawyers, we're trial lawyers. We can question pretty well. We can cross-examine anybody, right?
I'm accused of that at home all the time.
No, we don't. But you don't do that. You start with an opening question. Well, tell me what's going on, or what's on your mind. Very open-ended. Yeah. But then you don't ask any questions, because the moment you start asking questions, what do? Now it's on your agenda and what you want to know, not what the speaker wants to tell you, not what the speaker's agenda is. So part of listening from the frame of reference of the speaker is letting the speaker say what the speaker wants to say and give you the information that the speaker wants to give you. Then maybe later on, some clarification questions are important. Yeah. But we are way, way too quick to start cross-examining somebody to try to trip them up, or to try to show the basically argumentative questioning, where we're trying to prove to them how smart we are and how stupid they are, and they should immediately fall to the floor and kiss at your incredible wisdom and power. And
I love that. And actually, I'm curious to go deeper, because I stand to sort of learn here as well. Like, I often advocate getting curious to the extent that you would say, I'm curious. Can you explain more about, where those feelings are coming from? Or I'm curious, what could I do to help with that, or whatever, those kind of questions. So
those kind of questions, okay, the problem-solving questions come later.
Yeah. So it's the timing issue. That's a great distinction.
It is. And you don't want to jump into early problem solving. You don't want to jump into early questioning. What you want to do is listen, reflectively listen, until your speaker is relatively calm or feels like they've been deeply heard and validated, and you get them.
Yeah.
And then you can start saying, okay, so I'm curious, what do you think we should do about this? Or what's the best way to solve? What do you think the best way to solve this is? Now you're in problem solving mode. But again, once you ask that question, you've got to go back to listening mode.
Yeah.
And you can't, because you're going to be listening, the natural tendency is to listen for what they're saying. And does that match up with what I want?
Yes.
And if it doesn't, we spin off in trying to figure out how to bridge the gap. But no, you go into listening mode again until the speaker really feels like you get it. And then you can talk, and then you can go from there. In any negotiation, if you're not listening 90% of the time, you're screwing up.
Well, that totally resonates with me. And thanks for that. I love that sort of refinement, if you will, to that concept about that, not just the timing, but both that you immediately, even when you get to that stage, go immediately back into that reflective listening mode. I think that's such an important principle. And I'd love, how does this play into sort of the teaching that you do in the prisons with your inmates as your students? And
well, the Prison Peace Project is designed to take life and long-term inmates and turn them into powerful mediators and peacemakers to stop prison violence. And we've been doing this for 12 years. We're international now. It's been an incredible story and an incredible success. But the curriculum that we take our students through starts that we assume they have no interpersonal skills at all, which is probably a pretty safe assumption to make in prison. And so we teach them, we start with reflective listening, and then we teach them how to do peace circles. And then they have to go out for a week or two, and they have to use their reflective listening skills in peace circles and write it up, and they've got homework to do. And then they come back. And when they got all that done, then we teach them how to make durable agreements. How do you get somebody to do something? How do you reach an agreement with somebody, but the other person really wants to keep the agreement? How do you do that? And there's techniques for doing that. And of course, in negotiation, you're ultimately going to end up with an agreement, hopefully, and you want an agreement that's going to be durable.
Yeah.
Where people are going to do what they say they're going to do. So that's a fundamental skill that you have as a peacemaker. So we teach that to them. Then we teach them how to help people solve problems without giving advice. Because when they become mediators, it's voluntary and it's also party controlled. So you can't tell people what to do in mediation. But you do have to learn how to help people solve the problems they've got. Oftentimes, they haven't gotten clarity around even what the problem is. So how do you do that? And we use a process known as results-based listening. Again, listening. And the next module, we teach them how to manage strong emotions, how to deal with negative self-talk. We teach them how to develop their own emotional self-awareness so that they don't get triggered when they're in an intense conflict between two other people. And we teach them how to morally re-engage people who are morally disengaged. Again, a skill that's quite useful in prison. And then when they got all those skills mastered, which takes them a number of months to get to that level, then they're ready for the mediation workshop. And we take them through a 24-hour, pretty standard interest-based mediation process and teach them how to do that.
Yeah.
And then they go out and practice. And when they practiced enough, we certify them and say, okay, go out and make peace. And they do. They've stopped getting riots. They've stopped violence. We got a letter from the very first prison we worked in was the largest, most violent women's prison in the world. And we got a letter from the warden 2 years after we started the project saying the prison was completely quiet as a result of peace.
Oh my gosh, kudos, Doug. That's amazing. I mean, I love that you stepped up for it. It sounds like your curriculum is so fulsome. And I'd love, because I think it's valuable for everybody. Can you unpack a little bit that durable agreements concept and what are some of the top techniques that you teach? Because I think we're so focused normally, again, in that sort of North American model of this to get the immediate sort of short-term gain. And we often forget that durability piece. We want longer lasting agreements. We want better buy-in, right? So I'd love to hear some of your top techniques for our listeners.
So the most important thing we impart to our students is be specific. Most agreements fall apart because they are not specific enough. Okay. People assume, or people have expectations, or they just think the other person knows to do something. No, it doesn't work that way. The most important thing about a durable agreement is that you be very specific about who, what, when, where, how, and even why. And then you also talk about what are the barriers that are going to get in the way of you performing the agreement? What are all the things that you think will stop you from doing this? So we're anticipating failure and planning for failure. And the last thing we teach is, okay, what do we do if you do fall off the wagon? If you don't do what you say you're going to do, how are we going to handle a failure point?
Nice.
And when you do all of that, then you've got it more likely than not, the person's going to do what they say they're going to do. Because now if you've got a very specific agreement, you put it in writing, even if it's just handwritten, you can always go back to them and say, you know, when we did this agreement, you promised to do X, and right here you said, you know, we all agree you would do X, and X hasn't happened. Yeah. And I'm wondering what's going on. Tell me more.
Yeah. Well, and I love this idea about the barrier. And I'm thinking as you're speaking about, 30 years as a social justice attorney, and especially for my trade union clients, like doing labor law, you've got management where they've got collective bargaining agreements that come up every few years, and they rarely address the barriers, the obstacles, the specificity. In fact, they sort of avoid it. So it's no wonder that conflicts continue to come up over and over again. I think that's
that's right. And what my students learn is that it's hard work. You got to think. You got to think through what are all the things that can go wrong, or when we're specific, what do we mean by specific? And we have a really great exercise. We do a demonstration, and it's called the peanut butter and jelly exercise. And this is at the beginning of the module on agreements. And what we do is we say, all right, everybody write down instructions on how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So we give them a few minutes, and we have in front of them, we have bread and jelly and peanut butter and knives ready to go, and a lot of paper towels. Yeah. and we take it, and then we have somebody come up and we have them read the instructions. The instructions always make all kinds of crazy assumptions. So we do everything we can to follow the instructions literally. And if there are no instructions, then we just do whatever, we try to make the biggest mess we can. So for example, the instruction might say, open up a loaf of bread. Well, they're not telling us how to open up the bread. So we'll just take it and I'll pull the bread apart across the room, right? And then they'll say, put peanut butter on one side of the bread. So I'll take my hand into the peanut butter jar and I'll grab as much peanut butter as I can and I'll slap it on it. And I'll do the same thing with the jelly. And then I'll put the peanut butter and jelly together. So I'll make sure the peanut butter and jelly are on the outside.
Yes.
Together on the inside.
That's so good.
By now, they're cracking up and they're getting the point. And they never forget that exercise.
I bet.
How important it is to be specific. And don't assume that people know anything.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. Never heard that before. I think that's brilliant. And for our naysayers out there, because I know already there's going to be some people going, oh, that's crazy advice. I mean, the more specific you are, then the deal's going to fall apart because everybody's going to be thinking about everything that could possibly go wrong. So what do you have to say to that?
Well, do you ever wonder why when you get a piece of software, there's a licensing agreement that goes on for about 4,000 words? Or if you've ever had the joy of, I used to sue insurance companies. And so I became a coverage expert. And if you've never had the joy of reading an insurance policy, most people won't because their eyes glaze over. Why are insurance policies so specific? Because every single paragraph has been litigated somewhere in the last 400 or 500 years.
Yes.
They're specific because they weren't specific before and somebody took advantage of it.
Yeah, totally get that. I love that. And how do you define success, Doug? I mean, I think our society has become so driven for it's one of the reasons I assume you left the practice of law. You say, like, how we define success, I think is, sort of has priorities upside down. So I'd love your definition.
Yeah, for me, because I think this is something that everybody has to define for themselves. But for me, success is no longer about externalities, not about a big car, a big house, or prestige or money in the bank account. Success for me is really about happiness. And happiness for me comes from creating meaning in my life. And the way that I've learned to create meaning in my life is by serving others. So in service to others creates meaning, which makes me happy, which leads me to conclude that I'm leading a successful life. And I look at my peers and they're all worn out, tired, many of them dead, most of them divorced. And I left that life many, many years ago. And today I am successful. By any measure, I am successful.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful definition. I love that. I think I hope, and I believe that COVID has sort of opened a shift for people to reevaluate how they've defined success. And my hope is certainly that more people adopt the definition that you've just so beautifully captured for us. So I think, when we define success based on those external motivators, rather than finding that internal sense of absolutely unshakable peace and joy, it's a recipe for disaster. So what advice or hot tips would you have for people how to sort of negotiate with bullies or with people with more power? I have this issue seems to.
Oh, yeah. I talk a lot about power relations and power imbalance. So there are 9 basic sources of power. And I'm going to go through them all right now. I give you the graduate lecture, but I won't. Understand there are 9 basic sources of power. So if you feel like you're in a weaker power position, you got to decide what power is this person holding so they have influence over it. And basically power is the ability to either grant something or withhold something that you want. And the easiest way to deal with power imbalance is to take away the power. And you go, well, how do you take away the power of the strongest person? You make the thing that they hold over you no longer important to you. Now that takes some courage. It might involve sacrifice, but it's only short term. Because if you take what that person has is something you want, they can control you. But if you all of a sudden that's no longer important to you, they no longer have power over you.
Beautiful. Can you give one example of that? Just in sorry to cut you off, but like one type of power and how you might make that not important. I think this is really would be helpful.
Let's suppose that you're negotiating for a job, a raise. Or you're negotiating for a promotion, something like that. The people above you have the power to either give that to you or not give that to you. Before you walk into that conversation, you need to decide what happens if you need to know what your WATN is. What's your worst alternative to a negotiated agreement, your BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, and say, how important is this to me? And you got to figure out a way to make it not important, that you get the pay raise. But you also have to say, if I don't get the pay raise, then I've got to decide how much longer I'm going to stay in my current position and what is my plan B to do something else. Because if it's important to me enough to ask for a raise, then it's important enough for me that does have importance. But if I make it not important, that means I've got another alternative that's equally attractive to me. So that when I go into the negotiation, I'm not begging. I'm just saying, here's my demand. And what do you do? And all of a sudden, they don't have power over you anymore, because if they say no, no big deal. You just go to plan B. You quit and go somewhere else or do something different.
So good. And I love that you talked about the WATNA. I hear everybody always, you hear the experts talking about BATNA, and I virtually never hear anybody talking about the worst alternative to that negotiated agreement. So
you got to think, it's BATNA and WATNA. You got to think of them together.
Yeah, beautiful. And what role do you think preparation plays in effective negotiation?
Everything. There's no such thing as a negotiate. It's really interesting. I've been asked to talk to a local bar association luncheon in a couple of weeks, and I'm going to talk about the 10 steps that you need to take to prepare for mediating a litigated dispute. Because no lawyer, my experience as a mediator is that lawyers rarely come into mediation prepared.
I agree. Totally.
Preparation is everything. It can be the difference between getting a successful deal or not. But even in the cases where it may not be, it could be the difference in it could be as much as a 10 or a 20% swing in outcome. And with the internet, there's so much information that not preparing is, it's like driving drunk. Stupid.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Oh my gosh, I love that.
Do your homework. If you are negotiating for a promotion or a salary increase, you need to know what's your marketability right now. What are other companies paying for your skill set? And also in your skill set, what are other people like you, what are they getting paid? And in California, new law, I think over 100 employees, you have to post all of your positions and what they're being paid, job transparency, job salary.
That's exciting.
And that's good because there is a gender gap, obviously. And there's also even a gap between people maybe of the same gender.
Yeah.
Why is one person getting more money than the other? Is there education, experience, knowledge? What is it? And you just need to know all of that. And you need to know what another company might pay for your services, so that you got something to balance against. And this isn't information that you would necessarily use in the negotiation, something you keep in the back of your head, and you're always negotiating against your alternative. So if I know that the competitor will pay me $25,000 more than what I'm getting paid right now, and my current employer only offers me $20,000. I can make the decision. Do I prefer to stay with a known commodity at $20,000 or move to a new company with unknowns for the $5,000 bump? And that's how you influence your decision making.
And I love that. And part of that preparation too is not just looking at the bottom line. I find people always make comparing apples to apples. Maybe you're getting better training opportunity. And it's all part of that.
That's right. And looking long term, what experience am I going to get in this job that's going to push me into a higher level job 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road? And you've always got to be looking forward. I tell people, where do you want to be in 10 years? Where do you want to be in 15 years? Where do you want to be in 25 years? If you don't have those goals in mind, you're like a sailboat without a compass. You just blow with whichever way the wind goes. If you have a compass and you set a heading, you set your sails. No matter which way the wind is blowing, you can still stay on your heading. Even if the wind is coming right at you, you can tack up wind. And it's a little bit longer journey, but you can still maintain that heading. And it's the same thing with goals. And the beauty about goal setting is you can always change them.
Yeah. Well, I love that analogy, actually. And I think in life, like for our vision and dreams, most people don't actually set goals. We get so caught up in our to-do, errand-driven society that we don't have those dreams. My daughter and I created what we call a purpose planner for that reason, where instead of having your to-do planner, you have a planner that is helping move you towards your vision. And that for our listeners, I want to put a pin, that same approach also applies in your negotiations. So not just for your big goals, your big life goals, but also in your negotiation. Know where you want to go, set that compass, know what the outcome is, both in terms of relationship, process, substantive issues. So important. Now, you said you've got a 10-step process you're going to be talking about. Can you just maybe tell us the most important one? What are your top two, maybe, or three?
I think in terms of legal mediation, and this might be true in other kinds of negotiation too, but in legal settlement negotiations, the most important thing you can do is build a concession plan. And I never see lawyers doing this. So a concession plan in a distributive negotiation, it's give and take. You make an offer and then there's a counter offer and it goes back and forth and back and forth. Well, what people don't know is that these are very predictable and you can actually map out. Let's say you're going to make the first offer. Maybe you're a plaintiff and you're going to make the first offer. So you control where you start. And then you think about, okay, what do I think the defendant's likely response to that is going to be?
Yes.
And you work it all the way through and see, is it possible to get to a resolution if they follow my plan? And then you do it all over again, but you take it from the defense side and you just be as curmudgeonly as you possibly can be. And you do it again and you look at the model and say, okay, from the defense perspective, this is how they're looking at it. And then you do one more where you try to take both sides and say, okay, how do I make these work? Now you've got your concession plan and it's in writing and it's in front of you. You go into the negotiation, you make your offer, and they come back with an offer and you look and say, okay, where are they? Where are they on my chart? And if they're spot on, then you're great. If they're not on, then you say, what assumptions did I make that caused me to be in error? What am I missing here to cause them to be that way? You see how you can really get in depth in terms of your analysis.
Yeah.
And that to me is the single most important thing a lawyer can do in preparing for mediation. And if you're in a non-lawyer and you're bargaining in another environment, then you think about that. So for example, you're going to go in and don't ever think you're going to go buy a car and best the auto salesman. This is what they do for a living, right? You might buy a car once every 3 years. They do this every day. They're the pros.
Yeah.
But there are some things that you can consider. And so what are some of the trade-offs that you go onto the internet, you can find out what the true value of the automobile is, but what kind of interest rates can they give you if you want to finance it? How much money do you need to put down? What kind of terms can they give you? They can throw it, they do extended warranties, right? So they can give you an extended warranty. You don't have to pay for it. They want to make the deal. So this is part of preparation and also understanding, offer, counter offer, and thinking about, all right, what can you ask for? What can you get? And to sweeten the deal a little bit.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of this concession planning, as you say, and it amazes me how often, like, very skilled legal counsel who, have years of negotiation experience or in business, I mean, top, CEO level negotiations, and they see concession as a weakness. So they don't plan for it at all because they plan on not making concessions wherever
Right.
possible.
Which means they're not going to make a deal. I can tell you, I've mediated over 2,000 disputes. I can count on one hand the number of lawyers that I thought were good negotiators.
Yeah. I know it's embarrassing. It's a shame. It's true.
Lawyers are terrible negotiators.
I know, it's so true. And what role do you think emotion plays in negotiations, Doug?
It's everything. There is no such thing as an unemotional negotiation. All decision making is emotional. We're 98% emotional and only 2% rational.
Yeah.
And if you are not emotionally self-aware, and if you cannot emotionally self-regulate, especially around anxiety, then you're at a real disadvantage in a negotiation. Emotions are everything.
Oh, and I'm so glad I'm glad I asked the question, because I hear so many experts that, emotion has no place in negotiations. You hear that over and over again. It's like, it is so unrealistic to not address. And there's a difference between being emotional and bringing emotional awareness, bringing that EQ quotient, but to just say, no emotion, we're not going to consider it. Most of the studies never even used to talk about emotion as a factor in negotiation.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. We are emotional beings. We can't make rational decisions without being emotional first. Yeah. We can't. A negotiation is all an emotional process. And so to the degree that you are emotionally competent, self-aware, you can self-regulate, and you understand and know how to use cognitive empathy, you're miles ahead of other people.
Oh, totally.
So spending the time to learn how to be emotionally competent, if you're doing a lot of negotiations, really a powerful skill.
Yeah. And you've probably touched on this as we circle around these, but what do you see as the key reasons negotiations fail?
I think that people have unrealistic expectations of what's possible in a negotiation. I think that people fall into cognitive biases. Yeah. These are distortions in decision-making that they're not aware of, that cause them to view the negotiation in the world in a way that's probably not close to reality. So they see things in a different way. People become emotional. They become attached to outcome, and people become adversarial. Yeah. And when they become adversarial, then they become emotional and angry, and it now becomes all about ego. And so, there's a whole bunch of reasons why negotiations won't work.
And what do you think are the key? If you're going to list the top 3 skills that you think make for a great negotiator, what would they be?
Being emotionally competent, learning how to listen, and learning how to prepare.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. And how gorgeous, that circles right back to everything we talked about. So I love that. Yeah. Nice full circle there. And this has been fantastic. I can't believe how quick our time has gone, Doug. You're just a wealth of knowledge about this. And I love it. You bring different perspectives to bear, not afraid to challenge sort of the status quo, if you will, about what it means to be an effective negotiator. And I normally like to end by asking, what is one of the greatest mindset shifts you've ever had in your life? It can be on the issue of negotiation, but it doesn't have to be.
I think the biggest mind shift in my life has been to recognize that we're 98% emotional and only 2% rational. I mean, we're both lawyers. We were trained in the myth of rationality. And so to come to the realization that all that's wrong, that human behavior is not based on rationality. What separates us from other species is not reasoning and rationality, it's emotion. No other animals have emotion other than human beings. Yeah. Dogs don't have it, cats don't have it. We think they do, but they don't. They have something affect, which are not emotion. And so it's our emotions that separate us. And once I got that insight, everything changed, because when I walked into situations, especially high conflict situation where people were being emotional, I wasn't afraid anymore. I said, they're just being emotional. They're being who they are. Not a big deal. And I know how to handle emotions. I know exactly what to do. Yeah. And that shifted everything for me.
Oh. And I love you always are dropping these gold nuggets right at the end. That's a big one. Fear, right? I mean, it's because fear affects, so not allowing yourself to be self-aware about the role of emotion is going to increase your fear level, which is going to sabotage your ability to show up as a really effective negotiator. So,
and anxiety is a big one too. The one thing that humans can't stand is anxiety, and negotiations can be very anxiety producing. And so if you're not sufficiently self-aware to be able to recognize anxiety and deal with your own anxiety, you're in real trouble. Yeah.
Oh, I love it. Well, Doug, this has been awesome. I've been getting some extra nuggets myself here. So thank you so much for some of these insight shifts. It's been great having you. So thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you, Cindy. It's been a fun conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And for our listeners out there, if you want to learn more about Doug, which I invite you to do, he's doing some amazing work out there. You can check out his website at dougnoll.com, and that's Noll. We'll make sure to put this in the show notes. Also, you can check him out on LinkedIn, same thing, Doug Null, or on Facebook at Douglas Null. So I have zero doubt that you got loads of value from this episode. There was so much packed in a really accessible way, some great analogies and ways to reframe maybe how you've been thinking about negotiations, and give the gift of sharing. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast if you haven't, but also I invite you to share this episode with people who you think could benefit from it, which is just about anybody, because all of life is a negotiation, and there were some really valuable tips here. And just before we sign off today, just want to share a few ways we can work together if you're looking to up-level your negotiation skills. I have everything from online to signature one-on-one masterminds or VIP experiences. If you're wanting to dig in to better leverage your sort of natural power in a more authentic way to be able to get more of what you want and deserve in life, but also to get those better outcomes for everyone involved. So if that sounds interesting, check out our website at artoffemininenegotiation.com, and be sure to get my copy of my Art of Feminine Negotiation book, which has just recently launched. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, I invite you to go forth and find ways that you can rekindle your passion and stop missing out and get more of what you want and deserve in life, with better relationships, better buy-in, longer lasting agreements, and better, more creative outcomes, so that you can negotiate your best life on your terms. Until next time, take care.